Get ready to accompany me as we traverse a story so sinister that it seemed destined to never be told. The state of Maryland, where the waters of the Chesapeake Bay hold secrets that time refuses to reveal, is about to be the subject of one of the most unsettling chapters that the imagination can conjure. This video was made purely for amusement and is a work of fiction. Any likeness to real people living or dead is entirely accidental. In 1899, Maryland was going through a strange time in its past. The oyster and tobacco trade brought prosperity to the coastal port cities. Baltimore developed as an urban center, but the state's interior remained covered in small, remote communities and thick forests. However, villages where everyone knew one another, where news was delivered by mail, and where the law was frequently a faraway concept could be found just a few miles away. Our story takes place in this environment, notably in Dorchester County, an area with countless swamps, meandering rivers, and fogs that seem to. Suddenly, familiar landscapes become unfamiliar. Every trail, every shortcut through the marshes, and every lone house that dotted the wide, humid, green expanse were familiar to the people who lived here. However, even among the indigenous people, there were areas that evoked a respectful quiet, nooks and crannies in the forest where nobody went needlessly. One of these was the location of Wickham Manor. Although it wasn't precisely a manor in the grand sense that the term implies today, the property was amazing. Above all, there was an octagonal tower that protruded from the roof like an abandoned lighthouse, 3 stories of dark wood, tall, narrow windows, and a terrace that surrounded the entire building. The house's original builders had moved out decades ago, leaving behind hazy tales of arguments and financial misfortunes. The house was deserted for years. A lost traveler would occasionally knock on the door but never stay. They claimed that there was a problem with the location, a sentiment that clung to the skin like the air's perpetual moisture. Even when they were closed, the windows appeared to observe. Sounds like faraway voices were produced by the wind whistling through the gaps in the old wood. Discussions in languages that have been forgotten. Then, in the spring of 1899, a man posing as a doctor chose to take over Wickham Manor. He arrived alone in a carriage loaded with bulky trunks and crates, which he unloaded himself without assistance, despite the fact that no one had ever seen his diploma or heard of his prior practice, from the curious bystanders who came over. His name was Theodore Marsh, and the peaceful dynamics of the county were instantly changed by his arrival. Marsh was different from the other new arrivals. He didn't shop at the shops in the closest village, he didn't go to the local church, and he didn't take part in community meetings. Rather, Baltimore made frequent deliveries to him, big shipments that came in wagons covered in thick tarpaulins. These deliveries' contents stoked countless rumors in the saloons and local taverns. The few who were able to speak with Marsh described a middle-aged man with gray hair that was rigorously combed back, eyes that never blinked enough, and a voice that always sounded a little like a horse, as though he was always recuperating from a throat ailment. He wore elegant leather gloves that he never took off, even in the sweltering summer heat of Maryland, and he always wore black, even for the most routine tasks. Lights flickered in the tower windows at night. The steady, light from lamps or candles, but sporadic bursts of light that flickered across the windows, sometimes green, sometimes violet, and then vanished. Residents who lived nearby and whose properties were a few miles away claimed to have seen these lights and heard odd noises reverberating through the swamps, including metallic sounds mixed with what sounded like music or wind-distorted groans. Marsh only employed 2 workers to maintain the property: a reputable caretaker who resided in a cabin in the rear, a cook who came 3 times a week to prepare meals and then left before nightfall, always in a hurry, always looking back as she drove away down the dirt road, and a cook who drank too much and talked too little. When asked about her employer, she would turn her head away and mumble something about how big the house was, how the hallways seemed longer at night, and how doors she was certain she had left open were locked when she got back. It was especially oppressive in the summer of 1899. Over Maryland, the heat descended like a thick blanket, and it took conscious effort to breathe because of the humidity. The first really unsettling reports started to surface around this time. Farmers who worked in fields close to Wicker Manor claimed to have seen figures in the windows, shadows that moved in ways that defied the fundamental laws of perspective and light, and silhouettes that did not match the known human form. While navigating the river at dusk, a fisherman reported hearing screams from the property, but no cries for assistance or something different, pain, voices rising and falling in unnatural tones. With a vow to never again cross that section of water after sunset, he accelerated his ride and moved away. Then came the event that turned hazy suspicions into actual fear. The caretaker showed up in the closest village, stumbling, his clothes muddy and torn, on a moonless August night. With shaking hands, he went into the neighborhood tavern and placed an order for a drink. When he was able to speak clearly at last, he said only that Theodore Marsh was not alone in that house, that whatever shared that space with him shouldn't exist in this world, that he would never go back to Wickham Manor, and that no amount of money could compare to what he had witnessed that night in the tower. The man left the area that same day, leaving behind even his personal belongings, after drinking until he passed out and refusing to elaborate when he woke up the next morning. Additionally, the cook ceased to appear. Her absence was observed, because no one could find her, despite the fact that she was always on time. Her belongings were in their proper places and her house was empty, but she was no longer there. In the absence of hard proof, the issue progressively turned into yet another mystery surrounding that cursed property. Some claimed she had fled, while others claimed something worse had occurred. The lights in the tower continued to flicker through the darkness of Maryland nights as Theodore Marsh remained more solitary than ever in Wickham Manor, indicating something that no one could understand, offering insights that might be better kept secret forever. In the months that followed, a disquieting quiet descended upon the area like an imperceptible illness. Wickham Manor was no longer a topic of open discussion, but it persisted in the air, present in every look and every discussion cut short when a stranger entered. Everyone seemed to have woken up one day and agreed that it would be safer to ignore the situation, rather than facing it. Mists accompanied the arrival of last autumn, which painted Maryland's forests in amber and crimson hues. Dense and tenacious, they emerged from the swamps at dawn and dusk, turning familiar landscapes into unfamiliar places. Even the most familiar routes appeared to lead to unexpected locations in this dense haze, which also distorted sounds and made it impossible to calculate distances. On one of those misty mornings, a group of hunters entered the areas close to Marsh's land. They only intended to follow the path of a deer they had injured at dawn, with no intention of approaching the house. However, the animal took them farther than they had anticipated, through places they hardly ever visited, until they arrived at the edge of the property, where the forest gave way to untamed and abandoned gardens. They discovered something there that totally distracted them from the deer, on the boundary between the mansion grounds and the woods. A number of wooden stakes were planted, in a circle in the ground, each engraved with the symbols they didn't understand, combining geometric shapes with abstract representations that might be letters from an unidentified alphabet or just pointless decorations. The designs were elaborate and almost hypnotic. The most unsettling aspect was that the stakes appeared to be new. The wood was still light where it had been worked, and the earth in the circle's center appeared to have been disturbed, as though something had been buried, or, worse, unearthed. The hunters didn't. remained to conduct more research. More superstitious than the others, one of them made a protective gesture and advised them to go right away. Without further discussion, the others concurred, and upon their return to the village, they engaged in a lengthy discussion about whether or not to report what they had witnessed. They ultimately made the decision to share it only with a select group of reliable individuals. As a result, the information spread in whispers, picking up new details with each repetition until it was impossible to distinguish between what had actually been observed and what had been created or envisioned. Meanwhile, people started coming to Theodore Marsh. They were visitors from far and wide, always at night, and always by themselves or in pairs. They were not locals. In order to avoid drawing attention to themselves, they arrived in discreet carriages, but their presence was unavoidably noticed because in a place where everyone knew one another, every new face was noted down and committed to memory. These guests never lingered. They would depart as quietly as they had arrived after 1 or 2 nights. Arrived, but their departure was always different from their arrival. They had an expression on their faces that seemed unrelated to their physical well-being, a detached gaze, as though they had seen something incomprehensible. Some stumbled into the carriages, breathing erratically and leaning heavily against the wooden frames. One of these visitors was driven back to the closest train station by a coachman, who claimed that the man muttered and babbled about doors that shouldn't be revealed, about information that came at an excessively high cost, and about Marsh being an architect of alternate realities rather than a physician. The practical coachman blamed the droning on too much drinking, but the intensity of the passenger's voice troubled him for days. The seasons shifted, and the winter of 1899 gave way to 1900, with a snowstorm that cut off many towns for weeks. Wickham Manor vanished beneath a blanket of white, and for a short while it appeared that nature had chosen to hide all of the location's secrets, providing a brief break from the psychological strain the property placed on the area. However, stories kept coming out even in the deadliest months, when people gathered around hearths and roads became impassable. One lumberjack who went into the frozen woods claimed to have seen footprints in the snow that appeared out of nowhere, as though something had just appeared at a certain spot in space, moved a short distance, and then vanished without leaving any evidence. One more. The story was told by a woman who lived on a far-off farm, but had a window in her home that gave her a direct view of the mansion's tower. She described seeing a steady, intense glow that tinted the snow surrounding the mansion bluish, rather than the typical pulsating lights, coming from the tower for 3 nights in a row. The light suddenly went out on the 3rd night, and during the ensuing quiet, she heard a loud bang that rattled her windows. Home, even though it was a long way. When the sun finally emerged from the dense clouds the next morning, people watching Wickham Manor from a distance saw that something had changed. Although the structure seemed undamaged, the surrounding air had a distinct quality, a faint distortion that made it challenging to concentrate on the building's details. The lines curved almost imperceptibly, as if you were looking at something through slightly agitated water. Marsh, Theodore. During this time, it was oddly observed for the first time in months. On a gloomy January afternoon, he showed up in the closest village. Still wearing those leather gloves that seemed to be a natural part of his body, and still dressed entirely in black, he walked down the main street with his trademark upright posture. He went into the general store and bought something out of the ordinary. A significant amount of salt, different-sized mirrors, and a particular kind of rope used for marine navigation. Attempting to be the store owner, friendly and possibly elicit some information, remarked on the severe winter and inquired about the property's condition. Marsh turned slowly, allowing someone to get a close-up look at his face for the first time in months. Later, the shopkeeper would describe eyes that appeared to have been sleep-deprived for weeks, skin that stretched abnormally over the bones, and a smile that came in response to the question, but stayed isolated on his lips like a badly fitting mask, never reaching any other part of his face. Marsh retorted that everything was just fine, that his work was going according to plan, and that a demonstration of his years of research would be held shortly. He didn't explain what kind of demonstration this would be, just picked up his purchases, paid with coins that appeared to be too old to be in use, and walked away, leaving behind an unsettling silence and an unidentifiable chemical odor. The rumor of an upcoming protest quickly gained traction and sparked waves of conjecture and nervousness. What was Theodore Marsh going to disclose? In that tower, lit by unattainable lights, what sort of work was he doing? And more importantly, why was he making such a mysterious announcement now, after months of complete isolation? Those people's understanding of the boundaries between what is possible and what is not would be permanently changed by the answers to these questions, which would arrive in unexpected ways. Spring 1900 came slowly, as though nature itself was hesitant to approach Wickham Manor's surroundings. Even when flowers started to bloom elsewhere, the ground surrounding the property remained peculiar, with vegetation growing in erratic patterns that formed spirals and geometric designs that could not be explained by simple botanical coincidence. The ice in that specific area of County Dorchester took longer than usual to melt. Theodore Marsh began sending out invitations at this time. These invitations, written on exquisite cream, were not your typical ones. Colored paper with intricate calligraphy and a red wax seal with an unidentified symbol on it. A mix of lines that curve back on themselves and circles that are entangled. A different messenger personally delivered each envelope, always at dusk, and with instructions not to open them until the next morning. The recipients were influential individuals in the area. A former professor, a merchant who had traveled widely before settling in Maryland, and a retired lawyer with an impressive personal library. A number of people whose qualifications were not immediately apparent, but who shared a certain air of intellectual curiosity mixed with disenchantment with conventional explanations of the world, as well as a natural scientist who lived in seclusion after an unspecified incident in his earlier career. Even the invitation was brief, a private presentation of Marsh's work, which he described as merely an investigation of the limits between the known and the unknown, was extended to the public. The new moon was the date set. The darkness would be at its most complete in April. The assumption was that those who were interested would just show up. There was no way to respond or address for confirmation. Unavoidably, word of the invitations spread. A few of the invitees showed their close friends the documents. Others brought them up in passing during discussions. And before long, everyone in the neighborhood knew that something important was going to take place at Wickham Manor. Opinions were sharply split. For some, it was a chance to finally comprehend what Theodore. While some viewed the prospect of going onto that property as a sophisticated kind of temptation toward disaster, Marsh had been doing it all these months. There was a noticeable increase in activity around the mansion in the days before the event. For the first time, workers could be seen on the property preparing the entrance, cleaning windows and performing small facade repairs as carts carrying crates arrived. When these laborers finally completed their shifts and went back to the village, they were oddly quiet about the building's interior, merely noting that they were not permitted to enter past the main hall and that they had completed their work in the outside areas. However, one of these employees reported seeing something through a partially open window that greatly disturbed him after having a few whiskey drinks in a nearby tavern. He described a huge room that was much larger than the house's exterior measurements seemed to permit, with elaborate diagrams covering the walls that seemed to move when viewed from the outside and the ceiling lost in shadows. Outside, he claimed that a circular metal structure in the middle of the room reflected light in peculiar ways, producing patterns that were painful to look at for extended periods of time. A strange silence descended upon the night of the new moon. There was a dense silence that seemed to drown out even the heartbeats of those getting ready to travel to Wickham Manor. There was no wind, no sounds of nocturnal animals. 7 of the 10 original attendees chose to go, each battling their own. Apprehension and curiosity combined. They followed the now maintained road to the property, arriving at slightly different times. Visitors were guided through the complete darkness by a corridor of dim light created by the placement of lanterns along the road. With candles lit in every window, the mansion itself was dramatically illuminated, turning it into a massive lantern that pierced the night without the moon. At the entrance, Theodore Marsh personally welcomed them while wearing an even more formal outfit, a black velvet coat and those gloves that are always there. His face was thinner and his eyes were deeper in their sockets, but he still had a feverish intensity and an energy that seemed to come from somewhere beyond physical vitality. His appearance had clearly deteriorated since his last public appearance. He led the group through the entry hall, where a huge chandelier created dancing shadows on tapestry-adorned walls that showed scenes that were impossible for anyone in the room to fully understand. The pictures appeared to convey a narrative, but a story that deviated from traditional narrative structures by alternating between what might have been several temporal and spatial dimensions. Even though the reality was even more amazing than the story, the room they were shown validated the worker's description. The area, which was obviously bigger than the house's overall structure and stretched in all directions beyond what the external architecture would permit, was unachievable. Geometric diagrams, mathematical equations, and notes in various languages were all over the walls. Some are recognizable, while others are entirely foreign. The metal structure mentioned earlier occupied the center of the room. It was suspended vertically a few centimeters above the ground by unseen supports, forming a perfect circle about 3 meters in diameter. Although the metal surface had a mirrored appearance, the reflections it displayed did not precisely match the surroundings. There were imperceptible time delays between movement and reflection, as well as subtle distortions. Marsh placed his guests in semicircle-shaped chairs in front of the building, and at last started talking. His normally hoarse arrow voice was now clear and resonant, filling that impossibly large space with words that were both intriguing and slightly ominous. He talked about boundaries and how the world that everyone believed to be unchangeable was actually permeable and full of opportunities for those with the right information and guts to explore. He talked about research he had done, old books he had found, and experiments he had done alone in that tower, all of which pushed the limits of what is feasible a bit more. Some of the guests were clearly uncomfortable, while others were fascinated as they listened in increasing silence. When the former natural science professor attempted to inquire about the theoretical underpinnings of Marsh's work, he was gently silenced with a gesture. Marsh clarified that comprehension would occur via first-hand observation rather than verbal communication. Then he went to a control panel next to the round building, a table with instruments on it that combined acquainted with the utterly bizarre. Levers, dials, light-pulsating crystals, and wires that seemed to have no connection but hummed with energy were all present. The circular structure started to resonate after Marsh manipulated a few controls, releasing a low tone that was more audible to the bones than to the ears. Similar to heat rising from asphalt on a summer day, the air inside the circle started to ripple, but something more noticeable, more intentional, and gradually started to form in that circular space, the opposite wall obscured by an increasing opacity. It was something more substantial than smoke or fog. Our density indicated a depth where air should be the only substance. Eventually, pictures started to show through this opacity. fragments of locations that no one in the area could identify, perspective-defying landscapes, and buildings that did not follow accepted geometric principles. With a mumbled apology, one of the guests got up and hurried out the door. One more stayed seated and refused to look, covering his eyes. The others, on the other hand, were unable to look away despite every instinct telling them to do so because what they were seeing was beyond the capacity of human minds, as though they were turning the pages of a book written in a visual language that was beyond the realm of ordinary comprehension. The images inside the circle kept changing, moving from one scene to another without obvious transitions. In certain instances, they appeared to glimpse horizons that curved in the wrong direction, skies of unattainable hues, and occasionally shapes that hinted at presence but never fully solidified into anything recognizable. Standing in front of his control panel, Theodore Marsh made small adjustments while muttering to himself in a tone that was both satisfied and possibly nervous. Even with his ubiquitous gloves on, his hands trembled a little as he worked with the controls, and sweat shimmered on his forehead despite the room's cool temperature. After remaining seated, despite his obvious discomfort, the former science professor finally found his voice. What precisely were they observing, he inquired, in a tone that tried to sound academic but revealed a great deal of anxiety. "It's a window, an observation point into places that existed adjacent to known reality," Marsh replied, keeping his gaze fixed on his creation. Layers of existence that were always there but unseen until someone figured out how to. Perception. One of the visitors, a well-traveled merchant, got up slowly and walked toward the circle. His curiosity overriding his common sense, Marsh cautioned him not to touch the building or reach anything over the threshold, but he did not stop him. The merchant acknowledged with a nod and kept a safe distance, observing with a mix of amazement and mounting fear. Then something altered. The images that were moving through the circle started to stabilize and concentrate on a particular scene. It seemed to be some sort of interior, a room with oddly reflecting walls and furniture that looked useful but whose purposes were not immediately clear. Then there was purposeful movement in that faraway space for the first time. Something came into view. The nature of it could not be precisely identified. The viewpoint was incorrect. Its movement was certainly intentional, but the proportions were illogical. Whatever it was, it appeared, conscious that it was being observed. It moved toward what must have been its own side of the portal, and for a horrifying instant, everyone in Wickham Manor felt as though it was staring back at them. With a swift movement, the merchant retreated to the security of his chair. Another visitor started to pray quietly, using well-known words of spiritual consolation that seemed oddly out of place in that situation. The retired attorney, who had up until that point presented an air of intellectual skepticism, took hold of his. His fingers were white from holding the chair so tightly. Marsh made a dramatic change to his controls after observing the increasing restlessness of his audience. The opacity of the images in the circle gradually decreased until the solid, comfortingly ordinary wall on the opposite side was once again visible. The echoing voice that had filled the room faded to quiet, and the metal building stopped its strange radiance, becoming nothing more than metal reflecting candlelight. No one spoke for a while, and the guests sat there, taking in what they had seen, each of them handling it differently. At last, Marsh turned to look at them, and his face showed a mixture of fatigue and triumph. He had shown that years of isolation and experimentation had yielded observable results, even if those results went against everything that was thought to be possible by mainstream science. The first person to speak was the former professor, who spoke in a controlled tone. He asked what the ramifications of Marsh's developed regarding the possible dangers of opening such windows to unidentified locations. Marsh assured him that everything was under control, that precautions were in place, and that he fully understood the mechanisms involved in a response that didn't seem totally convincing. His eyes, however, conveyed a different message, one of uncertainty that ran counter to what he was saying. There were times when he gazed at the round building with a look that might have been taken as fear, as though they were unsure of what he had called forth. The meeting came to an awkward conclusion. Marsh tried to start more in-depth conversations about the theories behind his work and offered drinks, but it was obvious that his guests just wanted to get out. They said their courteous but hurried goodbyes one by one, making their way back through that impossibly long hall and out into a night that now felt reassuringly normal in comparison to what they had left behind. For a few more minutes, only the retired attorney was left. He had different questions, worries about legality and whether Marsh had thought through the ramifications of disclosing such a discovery. With a dry, humorless laugh, Marsh explained that he had no intention of making anything public, that the world was not prepared for the knowledge he had amassed, and that this small group represented the limit of his willingness to share. When the lawyer eventually departed, Marsh was left alone in his impossible room with the tools of his obsession all around him. He stayed there gazing at the now defunct circular building for a long time after the last visitor had left, absorbed in private thoughts. The visitors who had seen the phenomenon responded in different ways in the days after the demonstration. Some attempted to justify what they perceived as a complex trick, optical effects produced by projections and mirrors. Others welcomed the experience as confirmation of their own beliefs that reality is pliable. Among them, the man with "prayed throughout the presentation" showed signs of growing more devout, and attended services with a fervor that alarmed his family. Curiously, the former professor started writing to Marsh. Every week, letters were exchanged that explored the boundaries of what had been revealed, discussed theories, and debated philosophical implications. Everyone but the two correspondents would eventually be unable to decipher these increasingly complex and cryptic letters. Meanwhile, Wickchick's surroundings started to undergo minor changes. Manner. The ground's vegetation grew in ever more asymmetrical patterns that mirrored the diagrams covering the walls of that unreal room. Where wildlife had once flourished, there was now a silent perimeter as animals completely avoided the area. The tower's lights, which had been consistent for months, started acting strangely. They no longer pulsed sporadically but instead shone constantly but with an odd quality, as though the light flickered at odd times, frequencies that lacked a natural rhythm. Then, on a misty May morning, a fundamental shift occurred. Although they were unable to fully explain it, the few residents who lived close enough to have a view of the property noticed that the mansion appeared different. The building appeared to be slightly out of place, not in terms of its actual location, but rather in some other, harder-to-define dimension. A neighboring farmer made the decision to look into it, concerned that. He followed the well-known route to the property gates, but he hesitated when he arrived because he thought something might be wrong. Something in the air made his skin crawl, as if stepping over that threshold would be a decision from which there was no turning back. After battling opposing urges for several minutes, he ultimately concluded that his curiosity was not worth the intense discomfort he was experiencing. After returning home, he had unsettling dreams that night about doors leading to locations that shouldn't exist, about hallways that went on forever in unthinkable directions, and about a voice calling his name from a very distant but terrifyingly nearby location. The intense heat of summer seemed to concentrate, particularly on Wickham Manor's grounds, causing waves of distortion in the air that, when viewed from a distance, caused the property to tremble. Individuals started to steer clear of that direction altogether, departing from their customary routes in order to avoid having to go too close, as though it might be tainted by simple visual proximity. Since the night of the demonstration, Theodore Marsh had not been seen. No one noticed him picking up his deliveries, which kept coming in and were dropped off at the property's gates by progressively hesitant messengers. The packages simply disappeared for some reason. It's likely that they were taken inside the house during the night, or that they were used in an unconventional way that nobody wanted to think about. The former instructor who had exchanged letters. Early in June, Marsh received a final letter. This one was devoid of complex theories and philosophical debates, in contrast to the others. It was short, almost rushed. The normally accurate handwriting of Marsh devolved into hurried scrawls. He wrote about unanticipated breakthroughs, discoveries that went beyond his wildest dreams, and doors that opened to reveal not just new places, but also new ways of being. Additionally, there was a subtle warning in the form of well-chosen words that implied rather than explicitly stated that Marsh had come to the crucial realization that paying attention to these other realities was not a passive act. Rather, it served as a two-way bridge that enabled him to see both inward and outward, possibly even enabling something to see inward. As though Marsh had been interrupted in the middle of a sentence and never came back to finish it, the letter ended abruptly, leaving the final sentence unfinished. The former professor read those pages over and over again in an attempt to decipher deeper meanings, but ultimately, he stored the letters in a locked drawer and chose not to respond to choice that would come back to haunt him in the coming weeks. Events around the mansion started to intensify during this time, going from minor to unavoidable. There were reports of people claiming to have seen the property in locations that were obviously impossible. Glimpses of the recognizable tower that emerged on the horizon from the wrong angles and that defied the terrain's known topography. Area. Several miles from the actual location of the property, a woman who was driving along the main road at dusk described seeing the mansion perfectly reflected in a lake. Fascinated by the physical impossibility of the reflection, she halted her carriage to study it because it was so distinct and detailed. The lights on the tower in the reflection started to blink as she watched, seemingly trying to convey something. The sequence suggested language without using any code. Acknowledged. A group of laborers returning from far-off fields after a demanding day provided another account. At the same time, they all saw Wickham Manor's silhouette projected against the sunset clouds, not as a shadow, but rather as though the building had been moved into the sky and was suspended between space and earth like a vertical mirage. The vision vanished after a few brief moments. However, it was long enough for all 5 men to attest to what they had seen. These expressions started to have an impact on the community's mental health. The topic of the mansion was bound to come up in tavern and market conversations. Theories are proliferating uncontrollably, and speculations are growing more fanciful. Some claimed that Marsh had lost control over his experiments, and that whatever he had called forth was now acting on its own volition. Others suggested that he had evolved into something different from his previous self, having attained a level of comprehension that went beyond typical human limitations. Additionally, there were those, expanding minority, who thought the answer was simple. To guarantee that nothing could grow there again, Wickham Manor should be demolished, burned to the ground, and the land salted. On nights of heavy drinking, when liquid courage triumphed over common sense, these voices became louder. However, no one genuinely offered to take the lead on such an endeavor, even during the most heated moments. The retired attorney chose to take official action because he was worried about the escalating hysteria. He wrote an official letter to the county officials, stating in detail the community's worries regarding the activities taking place on the Wickcham property, and asking that an inquiry be carried out to make sure that nothing dangerous or unlawful was happening. Weeks later, the bureaucratic letter acknowledged the concern, but clarified that there was no legal justification for trespassing on private property in the absence of specific evidence of a law violation. according to the letter, if the resident's mental health was a concern, suitable. Medical proceedings ought to be started, but doing so would necessitate following established protocols and providing testimony from certified experts. The lawyer, unsurprised but frustrated, informed other community members who were also concerned about the response. On a sweltering July afternoon, they got together to talk about options, but they were unable to come to any concrete conclusions. How could they explain to far-off authorities phenomena that they themselves found hard to believe? How did they express apprehensions that sounded ridiculous when said out loud in daylight? As they argued, something remarkable was taking place at Wickham Manor. Working tirelessly in his impossible room, Theodore Marsh had made a vital modification to its round form. This was the culmination of months of experimentation, restless nights, and correspondence with his former professor delving into theoretical subtleties. Because the calculations indicated possibilities he hadn't tried before, he turned on the device with a new setting. Himself regarded as extreme. The structure started to vibrate, but this time the tone was deeper, and the vibrations were at frequencies that caused the surfaces of the objects in the room to tremble. Once more, the circle filled with that distinctive opacity, but this time it went beyond the metal ring's boundaries and filled the room's center like a growing bubble of non-space. Marsh observed, intrigued, and a little startled, as his experiment went beyond the predetermined bounds. Images created with the opacity, unparalleled clarity. They were now stable, comprehensive views of locations with strange geometries rather than fragmented glimpses. Then there was sound for the first time. Auditory impressions that developed immediately in the mind, reverberating like memories of previously unheard music, rather than sounds that moved through the air in a typical manner. As Marsh realized he was losing control of the experiment, he attempted to make changes. However, the controls weren't reacting as they should have. The building had accomplished a sort of autonomy, carrying on without his input. He took a step back and watched with a mix of growing fear and scientific pride as his creation developed beyond his control. More of the room was absorbed by the growing bubble of non-space, and Marsh became suddenly and horrifyingly aware that he had passed a point from which there was no easy way back. In reality, he had started to break down the boundaries between here and there, even though his goal had been to open windows to other places, letting disparate realities start to seep into one another. The sky over the property started to shift outside the mansion. A meteorological vortex that defied natural explanation was created when clouds formed spirals that whirled around the tower like water running down a drain. As sunlight passed through this peculiar formation, it took on colors not found in the typical visible spectrum. Colors that were seen as something more than gray or brown, but that the human eye was not capable of processing. Those who survived. Those who were close enough to witness the phenomenon sensed a shift in the atmosphere, a rise in pressure similar to that of a storm, but without the typical warning signs of approaching rain. The atmosphere tensed as though it were getting ready for something that had never happened before in the history of humanity. And inside Wickham Manor, Theodore Marsh stood by himself in front of his creation, dealing with the fallout from his ambition, perhaps for the first time understanding that some knowledge has costs that cannot be avoided, be compensated with only hard work and commitment, but needs something much more basic. With an unnatural speed, night descended upon Maryland, as though it were ready to embrace Wickham Manor. Normally, bright at that time of year, the stars appeared dim or far away, as though a veil of uncertainty had been placed between the earth and the universe. The ever-expanding opacity that now took up nearly half of Theodore Marsh's room remained in his impossible space, the space that is available. The structure continued to operate, apparently driven by something other than ordinary electricity or any source he could identify. despite his repeated attempts to shut it down, including disconnecting power supplies he believed were necessary. His mind was racing with desperate calculations as he went over each step that had brought him this far in an attempt to find the critical mistake that had turned a controlled exploration into something that threatened to destroy not only his work, but possibly a lot more. He vaguely recalled an equation about balances and points of no return from old texts he had studied years earlier. However, the specifics slipped his weary mind. He made the decision to try containment one last time. He went to a cupboard on the room's edge, that space that was still largely normal, and took out things he had prepared for hypothetical crises he never thought he would encounter. The mirrors he had purchased months earlier were there now, covered in symbols he had carved over the course of feverish work nights. The salt was there, lined up according to certain geometrical patterns. And there were the nautical ropes, which were treated with materials he had made using mysterious recipes and woven in specific ways. Marsh moved the mirrors at precise angles, poured lines of salt to form intricate figures, stretched ropes between fixed points on the floor, and so on, creating a barrier around the circular structure, ceiling of that unattainable space. He muttered words in dead languages while working, phrases he had committed to memory from books that would never be found in a public library. His attempt at containment triggered a reaction from the opacity. It pulsed, contracting for a moment and then expanding with fresh vigor. As though something on the other side had also noticed the attempt to cut the connection and was actively resisting, the images flowing within it became more agitated and less stable. That's when Marsh heard something that froze his blood, something much closer than a sound emanating from the metal structure of the portal. Slow, deliberate footsteps reverberated through his mansion's hallways. However, he was by himself there. He was certain of it. Since the night of the protest several weeks prior, he had not admitted anyone. He halted his work, remained motionless, and listened. The footsteps kept getting closer to his workspace. The rhythm had an erratic quality, a pattern that nearly, but not quite mimicked human gait. And then he heard his name called from somewhere in the mansion's dim hallways. It was his own voice, a flawless duplication of timbre and tone. Marsh realized what was going on with frightful clarity. He was seeing more than just other locations through the portal. It was letting things go through, and these things, whatever they were, had learned to copy, mimic, and possibly even replace one another. Bait was the voice calling his name in an effort to entice, removing him from the room's relative safety. He returned to his work with renewed urgency, completing the containment circle, activating each element of the barrier he had prepared. The mirrors started reflecting a series of images that appeared to be from their own theoretical plans, mathematical projections given visual form rather than the surrounding environment. The salt traced geometric lines on the floor like neon threads, shimmering with a cold bluish light. The chords became taut, pulsing with sounds that, in impossible chords, they harmonized. At last, the opacity that this complex barrier was facing started to fade. It shrank slowly, inch by inch, back to the perimeter of the circle. The images inside are getting more jumbled and less distinct. Observing the procedure was excruciating, as though reality itself were being repaired, with the sutures clearly visible and instructive. The sound of footsteps in the hallway suddenly stopped. His name was called, but the echo grew weaker until there was no more sound. Marsh gave himself a quick. He felt a brief sense of relief before realizing that his work was far from finished. The structure still worked, but he had stopped the expansion. The portal remained open, only momentarily blocked by short-lived barriers. He required assistance. Although painful, this realization was unavoidable. Alone with few resources and a knowledge that, as he now acknowledged, had important gaps, he would not be able to finish what he had begun. But to whom might he turn? Who would trust him if they didn't think he had fully? Has he gone insane? Who would know enough or dare to go into that room and face what he had made? The only person who had demonstrated a sincere interest in the work was his former professor, with whom he had corresponded for weeks discussing its theoretical ramifications. He would be the one to provide insightful advice, or at the very least recognize the scope of the issue. With caution, Marsh left the room, watching the dimly lit hallways for any indication that something was still prowling around his home. Without any problems, he reached his office and sat down to compose what would become his most significant letter. He made an effort to explain the situation in a way that would be comprehensible while also expressing real urgency, striking a careful balance between being truthful and not coming across as wholly unreasonable. As I was writing, a thick fog curled around the mansion like curious fingers as dawn began to brighten the horizon. People in the closest village were awakening to find that their dreams had been oddly similar, all involving doors that shouldn't be there, all experiencing an unexplainable attraction to a location they would vow never to go in daylight. The farmer, who had hesitated at the estate's gates a few days earlier, woke up completely certain that he had to go back. He couldn't figure out why. Even he was unable to describe the impulse. However, he was convinced beyond reason that there was something about Wickham's demeanor that appealed to him, something that had formed a bond during the times he had stood staring at the gates. In order to avoid waking his wife, he discreetly got dressed and stepped outside into the mist of the morning. His footsteps instinctively guided him toward the location that now took up an excessive amount of space in his mind, following the well-known route through his own fields and the row of trees that delineated his property's perimeter. Similar impulses were also experienced by others, some of whom had attended the demonstration weeks prior, while others had never been, who somehow had knowledge of the property's location and existence. The catches were gathered toward the center as though the mansion had cast invisible lines, psychic hooks that were now being pulled. While Theodore Marsh was still in his office completing his desperate letter, he was not aware that his attempt at containment, while successful in one way, had also unintentionally amplified some aspects of his experiment. The structure that was physically unable to grow had started to use other strategies to increase its influence, touching gullible minds and sowing compulsion seeds in psychologically fertile soil. As the fog grew thicker, figures started to move toward Wickjam Manor, each following a different path but coming together at the same spot, because they were drawn to something they couldn't identify but couldn't resist. Unwitting pilgrims on a journey whose goal was still unknown, despite the fact that their feet were still moving. The fog that now enveloped the whole area surrounding Wickham Manor made it difficult for the sun to shine through, establishing an enduring dusk that obscured the passage of time. In the event that circumstances worsened beyond his control, Theodore Marsh hoped that someone would eventually discover his letter, which he had finally sealed and placed on his office desk. When he went back to the impossible room to inspect its barriers, he discovered something that caused him to pause at the door. The lines of salt continued to shine. Their mathematical projections were still reflected by the mirrors. The impossible tones of the strings continued to vibrate. However, there was a new element in the air, a feeling of anticipation, as though the space itself were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The circular structure was still enclosed by the barriers, but the texture of the opacity inside had changed. It now displayed images that were more static and focused rather than flowing and changing all the time. Simple and dark wood, the door had a bronze knob that caught the light in an odd way, a door that was obviously leading somewhere, but not to any location that ought to be reachable by a dimensional portal in a mansion in Maryland. Reluctantly, Marsh watched that door inside the circle. theorizing about the nature of connections between realities had consumed months of his time. However, witnessing such a tangible example of traveling between worlds was both confirmation of his worst fears and validation of his work. It was possible to cross doors in both directions. The doorknob started to turn slowly as he watched, testing, as though someone on the other side was making sure it was locked. Marsh. He flinched instinctively, his gaze focused on that impossibility. The doorknob came to a stop, stood still for what felt like minutes, and then went back to its starting position. However, the message was unambiguous. On the other side, there was consciousness. There was a purpose, something new about the opportunity, and wanted to take advantage of it. Figures drawn by an unexplained compulsion started to appear outside the mansion. The first person to come out of the mist was the farmer, who had glassy eyes, strolling while they're asleep. Without hesitation, he went through the gates and started up the path that led to the main entrance. He didn't hesitate, as he had on his last visit. Instead, his steps were steady and deliberate. The woman who saw the impossible reflection in the lake and the merchant who had seen the demonstration were followed by others. Some faces that even if Marsh knew they were coming, he wouldn't recognize. Like pieces in a game with no rules, they gathered on the mansion. Of them were moved by unseen strings that were linked to something profound in their minds. Marsh was still in the room when the main door opened in the distance. It had opened, as though welcoming the guests, without being forced open. At that moment, he realized that although his barriers were successful in stopping the portal's physical growth, they were ineffective in stopping its more subtly influencing effects. Instead of expanding through space, the structure had discovered a way to expand through people's minds. Expansions of its existence. He had to move fast. It was impossible to foresee what might occur if those individuals entered the room and witnessed what he had produced in his current state of psychic vulnerability. They may attempt to pass through the portal. They could disrupt the containment barriers, or just by being there, they could give the opposing side a stronger anchor in this world. After locking the heavy door behind him, Marsh walked out of the room. In addition to the traditional lock, using extra, he hurriedly drew symbols with the chalk he always kept in his pocket before descending the stairs to the main hall, where he could already hear his unintentional guests' numerous footsteps reverberating through the hallways. Marsh felt both sympathy and despair when he discovered them huddled in the hall like guests waiting for orders. These individuals fell prey to his ambition. Unaware of the extent of the web he had created, innocence became entangled in it. Their expressionless faces looked, evidently under some kind of influence that repressed their individual wills, more through him than at him. By using sensible language and appeals to their common humanity, he attempted to communicate with them and bring them back to normal consciousness. Some blinked, fleeting flashes of recognition passing across their expressionless faces before the urge took over once more. It was similar to attempting to rouse people from a deep slumber. His efforts only had short-term effects before they reverted to their initial state. Then Marsh thought of something. He might be able to free them using the same ideas if the structure attracted them with psychic connections. Running back to the office, he picked up a box of crystals he had made months earlier for various experiments. In order to test the theory that each crystal could function as a disruptor of specific kinds of subtle influences, each crystal had been treated with particular compounds and exposed to specific sound frequencies. He went back to the hall and started placing the crystals in a protective circle around the group. He whispered words intended to serve as counterspells, words that conveyed intentions of liberation and clarity as he positioned each piece. He started to notice changes very slowly. People's postures relaxed a little, and their eyes blinked more often. Tiny indications that their separate consciousnesses were starting to take back control. The first person to fully recover was the farmer. He shook his head as if he had just emerged from the water, glanced around bewildered, and then fixed his gaze on Marsh with a blend of fear and mounting rage, wondering how he got there, what had happened, and why he wasn't clearly remembering the trip. Theodore Marsh faced the group, which was becoming more conscious, with a candor he had seldom permitted himself. He gave a straightforward explanation of what he had produced, acknowledging that his experiments had gone beyond his control and that something had been opened that was now resistant to closure. Months of solitude weighed heavily on his voice, and the resentment of ambition gave way to regret. The woman who had noticed the reflection in the lake asked a question that startled everyone, and the farmer wanted to leave right away. She questioned whether the issue could be resolved by demolishing the building, or if it would be sufficient to leave the portal open with no way to eventually close it. In his panic, Marsh had not given enough thought to this practical consideration. Although he acknowledged that he was unsure, his intuition told him that straightforward devastation might exacerbate the situation, eliminating the only safeguards that were in place and creating a gap between worlds that will never go away. Proper conclusion, not elimination, was what was required. The connection would be thoroughly sealed with a methodical closure. Regaining his normal practicality, the merchant advised them to leave the area and look for outside assistance. People who knew things Marsh obviously didn't know on his own. But before they could discuss this option in depth, there was a noise in the mansion. There was a reverberation that shook the place, like breaking glass magnified 1,000 times. Walls, and caused the ground to shudder under their feet. Marsh was immediately aware of what had occurred. After one of the barriers gave way, he dashed for the stairs and the others followed him after a brief pause, propelled by a morbid curiosity that outweighs fear. The door he had locked and sealed was wide open when they arrived at the corridor that led to the impossible room. The wood was still there, but it was no longer a barrier. The scene had drastically changed inside the room. The surfaces of the cracked mirrors reflected 1,000 warped images of their surroundings. The air was perfectly still, but the lines of salt had been dispersed as though by a powerful wind. The circular structure now gleamed with an intensity that was painful to the eyes, and the ropes hung loosely, their tension gone, their tones muted. The opacity was so thick that it appeared to be physically solid. It was the same door Marsh had seen earlier, but it was now ajar. A tiny bit of absolute. Beyond it, darkness was visible. The surrounding light seemed to be drawn in like a vacuum by the darkness. Nobody said anything. The group stayed at the room's entrance, facing the enormity of what Marsh had attempted to keep to himself. Surprisingly, the farmer was the one who spoke up. "There were limited choices now," he said simply. "Try to stop it collectively or flee and allow it to grow unchecked." Instead of a formal discussion, the decision was reached through a mutual understanding that passed between them at that precise moment. They would remain. They would assist because individual escapes seemed less significant in the face of something that might endanger more than just their own lives, not because they fully understood what was happening or because they felt especially courageous. Touched by this sudden devotion, Marsh started teaching right away. He delegated work, rearranging the crystals in different locations, and reconstructing the salt lines according to the precise patterns he explained. Specific arrangements, maintaining specific rope tensions as he tried to recalibrate the structure using his broken controls. Gradually, something started to change as they worked in concentrated silence, each person doing their part. The glow waned a little in intensity. The door inside the circle started to close inch by inch as the opacity became less dense, driven by unseen forces that they were all working together to summon. However, just when it appeared, they might be successful. Something on the opposite side grabbed the doorknob inside the circle, and they all watched, frozen for a moment, as fingers that weren't really fingers wrapped around the metal, holding it in place and keeping the door from closing all the way. What transpired next would put their dedication to correcting Marsh's error to the test, as well as their own comprehension of the extent to which they were prepared to go in order to keep something unfamiliar from completely entering their world. At that moment, Theodore Marsh realized that his approach had been essentially wrong from the beginning. By treating the portal as a mechanical issue that needed to be resolved with tangible tools, he attempted to erect barriers, impose external controls, and force closure. However, his creation functioned on levels that went beyond the merely material. The solution was persuasion rather than forceful closure, and balance rather than resistance. With an urgent yet oddly composed tone, he conveyed this realization to the group, stating that they must radically alter their strategy. They needed to start a conversation in order to develop a shared understanding that would enable a mutually agreeable resolution, rather than resisting the other side's presence. The woman in the lake inquired as to how one could communicate with an entity that was not human and that functioned on entirely different principles. Marsh retorted that language was more than just words, and that there were deeper levels of communication through patterns, intentions, and the universal mathematics that supported every reality. He went to his controls and started adjusting them so that the portal would modulate rather than close, producing resonance patterns that would serve as a common language. As if it were learning to respond, the structure's luminosity pulsed in rhythms that progressively grew more regular and deliberate. The fingers that had been gripping the doorknob loosened up a little, but they were no longer forcing. It was a tiny but important indication that there was money coming from the other side, was prepared to at least think about alternatives to a full-scale invasion. Drawing on his negotiation expertise, the merchant proposed to offer something in return for the closure, some sort of recompense for the access being denied. But what could be offered to a consciousness that existed beyond human material needs? Marsh's fingers hesitated on the controls as he considered this. The farmer came up with the ultimate solution. Perhaps entry into our world was not what was being sought, he suggested, but merely acknowledgement. Proof that their reality was just as real as ours, and that multidimensional existence merited respect rather than invasion. After giving this some thought, Marsh saw the profound truth in that straightforward observation. He had approached the entire endeavor as an explorer, viewing other realities as areas to be charted and investigated, never taking into account the possibility that there might be consciousnesses there that were entitled to the fundamental courtesy of consent. He changed the arrangement to reflect this newfound comprehension, transforming it into patterns of energy that pulsed around the circle. It was an acknowledgement message, an apology for the inadvertent intrusion, a proposal for a respectful conclusion, and a pledge that any future interactions would be handled with far more care and consideration. As they waited for a response, the room fell silent for extended periods of time. The hand around the doorknob then gradually let go. Slowly, the door inside the circle started to close on its own, giving last glimpses of that, somewhere else before fully sealing. However, something went through it before it closed entirely. Everyone in the room sensed it, even though it wasn't tangible in the traditional sense. It left a lasting impression in their memories of something they had never experienced. They understood that although they had accepted the closure, the connection remained dormant, and that once doors were opened, they left behind traces that persisted even after they were closed. The opacity diminished. The round building came to a halt. Radiant. The room was too large for their home, but it was no longer impossible, and for the first time in months, it was just a room. The ensuing quiet was one of cautious relief and mutual tiredness. Marsh fell into a nearby chair. His muscles finally relaxed after months of tension. As they processed what had happened and realized that their lives had changed in ways that would take years to fully understand, the others gradually relaxed as well. Neither of them left the mansion during the remainder of the night, wishing to be by myself right away following such an encounter. With their newfound understanding of the permeable nature of reality, they whispered to each other about what they would do next, how they would explain their absences to concerned families, and how they would resume their regular lives. Marsh committed to systematically dismantling the structure, not destroying it, but dismantling it in such a way that the knowledge would not be lost and could not be readily duplicated without, being aware of the obligations that came with such authority. The group left Wickham Manor with a tacit agreement to never fully discuss what had happened there, but also to never forget the lessons learned about curiosity, responsibility, and the costs of pushing boundaries without thinking through the repercussions. Dawn finally arrived, bringing clear light that dispelled the lingering fog. For several more months the mansion would stand before Marsh eventually left it, heading off to an unidentified destination, carrying his records and memories with him, leaving behind nothing but a deserted building that would eventually collapse into ruin, forgotten by everyone but those who had witnessed those pivotal evenings when the lines separating worlds nearly fell away. Silent changes occurred in that part of Maryland in the ensuing years. Wickham Manor was still deserted, its windows slowly encrusted with dust, its gardens reverting to their untamed state. Although the building was still visible against the horizon, it had lost. It lost the eerie quality it once had, and was merely one of many abandoned buildings strewn across the interior of the state. Those who had taken part in those last events continued living their lives, carrying with them something they were unable to adequately describe but which had radically altered their understanding of the world. They rarely talked about that night directly, but they did occasionally cross paths and exchange meaningful looks at neighborhood events. A few things were too big to put into words, experiences that should be respectfully kept quiet. The farmer persisted in cultivating his land, but he formed the habit of observing the night sky with a fresh sense of admiration after realizing that there were layers of reality above the visible stars that he could hardly fathom. The woman by the lake kept a locked journal in which she recorded ideas and observations that her descendants might eventually be able to read and attempt to comprehend. As completely as he had appeared, Theodore Marsh vanished from local narratives. Some stated, no one was certain, but some claimed he went west, while others said he went back east. All he left behind were memories and a vacant building that served as a testament to aspirations that went beyond sensible bounds. The lights that flickered in the mansion's windows vanished forever, but the tower of the mansion remained a landmark against the sky. The grounds were still occasionally covered in mist, but it was now just regular mist, not from portals between dimensions, but from the dampness of the swamps. Slowly, nature was taking back what had been, momentarily upset. Travelers passing through the area decades later would occasionally pause to take in the expanding ruins of that odd property, curious about its past and creating their own stories to explain why such a magnificent structure had been abandoned. Every story they shared with one another was a watered-down version of reality. Rumors turned into local legends that hinted at something bigger, but they never adequately conveyed the scope of what had truly occurred. Thus, Wickham Manor eventually faded into the background, a historical curiosity for anyone interested in historic buildings or deserted estates. Only those who were present and who made the decision to keep that knowledge private, secure, and revered knew the secrets that its walls witnessed. Because not all stories are intended to be shared widely. Some experiences are more than just stories, and some doors that have been closed deserve to stay closed. They stopped crossing their thresholds. Their promises of other worlds left in peace to preserve the integrity of reality and to temper human curiosity however noble, with discernment about when to stop pushing the limits of the unknown. They claim that the mansion is still standing there, a silhouette against the Maryland sky, a silent monument to aspiration, exploration, and, in the end, the decision to close what should never have been opened. It serves as a reminder to those who are aware of its actual history that not all knowledge should be pursued, not every frontier traversed, and that knowing when to back off can sometimes be more courageous than venturing into the unknown. Please share your thoughts in the comments section if you found this trip through Maryland's shadows enjoyable. For more tales that delve into the forgotten nooks of the imagination, subscribe to the channel. Until the next tale.